Good afternoon, Nick. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. It's been a long week and it's only Thursday. So
Tell me
looking
about
forward to the weekend, but almost as much as I was looking forward to Keir's speech today on opportunity, which was, I think, interesting for a whole range of reasons.
Well, it was interesting to see them finally launch that opportunity mission. I know certainly from our Purpose Coalition work, I think it's been the one we've been most anticipating. We've sort of seen every couple of weeks them setting out different ones, whether it was Wes Streeting launching the health mission or the energy mission that we saw with Anna Sarwar and Ed Miliband. But I think from a Purpose Coalition perspective, it's one that we have really been looking forward to and have been pretty excited about. And there's actually quite a lot of very interesting things, particularly I think relating to the early years goals and the those first couple of purpose goals that we've got, and how that links. And I think what was really interesting from my perspective, how this is a much broader mission with energy focused just on that one area of energy and the links to the cost of living, or on health, very much focused on that health community idea. But then with this, although it's very much education first, it actually crosses right across the spectrum of government and different departments and different policies.
I guess you could say that Labour's policy up until now has been particular policies geared towards particular groups of people, parents, people who use the NHS, which I suppose is most of us, but particularly people at times of difficulty in their lives, and opportunity is the one mission which really does cut across, as you say, everything, every part of society, and I think that everybody has a view on whether things feel fair or not at the moment, and I think Labour's tapping into that sense of trying to create a better, fairer, level playing field for people because so many people feel that it's all stacked against them at the moment.
One of the things I thought was interesting is, why has Bridget Phillipson been the one who's been chosen to front this up? It could have been Lisa Nandy in the leveling up, but shadow leveling up department. But why do you think they've chosen Bridget to launch it?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and uh, I suspect it's probably because uh, Lisa's role in leveling up is more about place and geographical disadvantage that can sometimes come about. And people nearly always talk about leveling up in the same context as red wall seats, for example. And so already in people's mindset, there's something about spreading a lump of economic opportunity further north. That's the sort of mindset that I think the way that the context that leveling up has been debated tends to conjure up. Um, and also it's about tackling inequality, but tackling inequality and creating opportunity are not the same thing, because tackling inequality is dealing with people who are most disadvantaged in society. Creating opportunity applies to everybody, and the whole point around social mobility is that everybody should be able to make progress right the way throughout their lives. The challenge, as always, is that some people have either greater advantages or greater disadvantages than other people at the time of their birth and early years. And that's why I think probably Bridget, because of the focus on education, being probably the single biggest um, driver of opportunity change, or people's ability to change the opportunities that you were born with, is education in the broadest sense.
I think it suggests, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it suggests that education is going to be an absolutely central part of the next Labour government, and how they pitch it to people in the election campaign to come.
Well, and I remember a former Labour Prime Minister saying priorities were education, education, education. And my experience, I've had a fair amount to do with the education system over the years, both as leader in Newcastle and before that as chair of a Sure Start Centre in the West End of the city. And actually, it's that point in kids' lives which as particularly as brains are developing and people's social and cognitive skills are developing, that's the point in their lives where the, the differences between people's experiences have the greatest impact and resonance right the way throughout their lives. So if you can make it a fairer system, a more equal system at that point, that reduces the overall impact of inequalities over the next 7 or 8 decades of people's lives.
I didn't realize you chaired a Sure Start Centre. That's really how was
It
that?
was,
It was really interesting.
it was,
Was that before you
yeah,
were leader?
yeah, it was before I was leader, and it was in the heady days when Sure Start was a universal service, and any child, regardless of background, parental income, anything like that, had was able to access Sure Start, and it was part nursery provision, part welfare support, if I'm honest. And I remember one of the things that we built were some programs around. So one of the things that has a really significant impact on kids is their parents reading them a bedtime story. And this Sure Start Centre, West Riverside, it was called, was in the West End of Newcastle, covered areas like Scotswood. And one of the reasons why some parents weren't reading their kids a bedtime story was because the parents couldn't read. So one of the initiatives that we set up in it was a kind of encouraging your kids to have a bedtime story initiative, which brought the parents in, and well, not me because I just chaired the board, but the Sure Start Centre actually taught the parents how to read and how to add up as well. And that was transformational, not just for those kids because they were getting a bedtime story from their dad for the first time ever, but also for those parents who suddenly saw a world of opportunity opening up to them. And so that's why we oversimplify these interventions, and we say, "Oh no, that's just about children or whatever." But actually, you could see how Sure Start, because it was about a community and a place, had an impact right across everybody in the family.
Just on that, do you think sometimes that Westminster, in particular, and other elected bodies as well, but particularly Westminster, just forgets about some of these really basic things about parents' ability to be able to actually read that bedtime story? Sometimes it can be put down to other reasons why parents wouldn't do that, but actually sometimes those really basic things are just forgotten about and totally missed, not necessarily through any negligence, but just because people assume that they can.
So, I mean, another example that was told to me by a friend of mine who's leader of Bradford City Council, and had a real issue with kids that teachers thought were being disruptive in class, and uh, all sorts of the tendency then is to think about behavioral cognitive psychology and uh, family interventions and so on. Actually, the problem was the kids had bad eyesight, never had their eyes tested, and couldn't see properly.
Yeah.
So it was all behavior is communication of some form. It was basically a way of saying they weren't engaged in what was going on. And so Bradford came up with a glasses for classes scheme, which made sure that kids got their eyes tested. Now, again, that's another really, really obvious, simple thing to do, but it got a bit overcomplicated because people over intellectualized it.
Yeah. I mean, I, I think it's a really important point. And actually, it's a good way of how local government has played a part over the last 13 years, in particular, at filling some of those gaps where there hasn't been national funding for it. I know it's something you did in Newcastle as well. I think if we go on to sort of Keir's speech, and I thought it was really interesting that he set that speech out the day.
Sorry, Matthew. That was my sort of attempt to replicate the protests that went on. And actually, I thought Keir handled that pretty well. He's quite good under pressure, you know.
There's going to be somebody in trouble for that.
Sorry, that flowed to you, didn't it? Because you're not used to being interrupted when he's talking.
There's going to be someone in trouble
Knock
for
knock.
how they managed to get in.
Knock knock.
Who's there?
The interrupting sheep.
Who's the interrupting sheep?
Bah! Anyway, sorry, you were saying.
Well, I mean, I thought it was really interesting that he launched it in Gillingham. They could have gone to any other part of the country, but Medway was that sort of red belt that flipped in 1997 and stayed with the party until 2010. And it was, you will remember, it's the place where Tony Blair and Gordon Brown had their big ice cream moment and make up in the 2005 election campaign when Gordon bought Tony an ice cream. I think he joked that there was, you never normally get anything for free from the Chancellor. But I thought it was really interesting they chose there to launch that mission today. I don't know what you think, but why they picked there and not a city outside of London in the north, for example?
Partly, I think, because Labour has historically been electorally really quite strong in the cities. And while that's important in terms of core support, being able to demonstrate electoral reach outside of the cities, and you're absolutely right, places like Medway and Gillingham and Kent and that kind of area, basically abandoned Labour, or you could argue Labour abandoned them, and were very, very strong Brexit voting areas. And actually, the local election results last time around demonstrated that those areas, for the first time, I think, voting intention wasn't almost exclusively determined by people's position on the Brexit debate. So I think there's a sort of re-engagement process going on here. The other reason why Keir will have gone to Gillingham this morning is because the leader there, a guy called Vince Maypole, is actually a very, very good example of opportunity throughout people's lifetimes and how important it is. Because Vince, if you met him, you'd think he looks like he's just been to a rock concert. He has the long ponytail, he's got a leather jacket, and he looks like somebody who's enjoyed his social life. Let's put it like that. But tell you what, he's as sharp as a tack. He's really well organised, and he's got a huge, huge brain that understands that not everybody thinks like middle class intellectuals, and what you need are solutions that appeal to real people in the language that they understand. And so Vince is somebody who really gets this, both from his own personal perspective and experience, but also because he's passionate about making sure other people have opportunities too.
Yeah, and I think I think it was national news with him
If you're
dancing.
listening to that, Vince, by the way, I do hope you like my description of you and it wasn't too rude.
I remember that scene of him dancing in the middle of the Court Hall at about 4 o'clock in the morning as they won in the local elections. It's
Well, of
quite
course, he's used to dancing at 4 o'clock in the morning, of course.
it's some sort of highlight of Labour Party conference, I can imagine.
Oh, there are many others. But as the rule goes, what happens at Labour Party conference stays at Labour Party conference. Anyway, we was talking about oil, weren't we, and Keir's speech. But in all seriousness, I think this that fundamental point that Keir made at the start of his speech about how security is the foundation of society, I think it's not just a series of words that you haven't heard from Labour for a while. There's actually a really, really important principle behind that, I think. And I used to have battles with people in Newcastle over tactics against the far right, because a lot of people wanted to fight the far right in the protest marches that we had a few years ago that were very prominent by coming out and showing a strength of force against them and going out and protesting and saying, no, you're wrong. And I always felt instinctively that making sure that the far right didn't have any fertile ground to sow their seeds of hatred in was the most effective way of countering them. So making sure that people felt secure in their job, people feel secure in their home, secure in their community, as though there was a sense that things were going to get better in the future if you worked hard for it. Now, these are not new concepts, but I'm really pleased that Labour is frankly rediscovering them after a period of absence, if I can put it like that. And I think that sense of, I've always talked about good work being the foundation of a good society because that enables people to put down roots, feel they've got a stake in the world, feel part of a community, feel part of the future. And so, security, we tend to think of it in defense terms, but actually, security is about your sense of belonging, well being, and opportunity for the future.
I think that's a really important point, and it's actually something that there's sort of five subcategories within that opportunity mission. And I think one of the really interesting things is on the first one, the document that the parties published today talks about making security the foundation of opportunity. And it talks about things like a secure home, a safe community, and public services that are there when you need them, that link much
It's,
more broadly than just the education department, but across, but fundamentally come down to that point around opportunity. And I think you've seen them talk as well today about free school meals and the importance that has on helping people. And of course, something I know you've spoken very passionately about in the past as well.
oh God, I hated having free school meals at school because I qualified for them, and uh, in my school at the time, to get your free school meals, uh, everyone was given dinner tickets for the week. If you're on a free school meal, you got a different coloured one. So not only did the dinner ladies know, but anybody who saw you holding your ticket in the queue to go in knew that you were getting a free school meal. And that was, I mean, I hated that. And I hated the fact that uh, people used to bully me about it because
But
it's,
why is it like that? Because if you think about, if you get on a bus with your over 60s bus pass, there's nothing else to differentiate it from an Oyster card, or where a pop card, or whatever the kind of card that's used locally. It seems strange that there's almost a marker on you.
and it's one of the things that actually schools have made a huge amount of progress. And I did a lot of work in Newcastle around what we call destigmatizing um, schools in terms of uh, poverty and household income, so that, for example, it didn't matter how school meals were paid for, whether they were paid for by parents or free. Everybody used the same payment system, so you get a charge card or a fingerprint that just enabled you to pay, and nobody knew any different. It's a bit like building mixed communities, and why I think it's really important to have affordable housing as part of new housing estates, because there's no point building communities if everybody is the same and other people are segregated out. And similarly, things like school trips, making sure that parents weren't asked for vast amounts of money to pay for school trips at one go, otherwise their child wouldn't be able to go. The number of times it's heartbreaking to see kids miss out on those kind of opportunities because their parents just don't have income. Or kids, even things like cookery classes where kids would come in and, oh, I forgot it, miss, or it got stolen on the bus or whatever. And that was actually meant that their parents didn't have the money to buy it. And uh, people find all sorts of ways of excusing that because nobody wants to admit to being poor. It's not nice. So that kind of differentiation, I think, getting rid of that stigma is really important, but also making sure that people have the support at the time when they need it. And that's the broader point here, because I think what we're seeing is a kind of reinventing of the principle behind the welfare state, which is about universality and availability at the point in which, at times when people need it. And that point of universality is a principle I think we've lost in so much of our public services over the last couple of decades.
I think it's a really interesting point, and some of the stories you talk about, children missing out on certain things because schools have to ask for whether it's bringing in ingredients for cookery lessons or school trips. Or do you think there's been much progress? I mean, how much of a role do you think government has to play there in terms of? And how much role did you play in local government in terms of trying to fix some of those problems?
Do you know, I remember exactly that question being played out in when we first started to get school breakfast clubs sponsored by Greggs. And Greggs are obviously a big company, well, big company everywhere, but based in Newcastle. Uh, in fact, on a good day, I can smell the pasty factory from home. And it sort of flushed out this interesting debate around why are schools providing breakfasts for kids? Why aren't parents doing it? And it didn't really matter how many times we asked that question. The fundamental problem was kids weren't getting their breakfast.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things, it still makes me upset to think about it. One of the things that I remember from my show start days when I chaired that show start was kids buying boxes of broken biscuits in the corner shop for 50p because that's all they could afford.
Mm.
No child in this country, in this day and age, should ever be forced to eat broken biscuits for lunch.
And that's a thing. Like going back to that point around Westminster, I think people just don't quite understand quite how, and it's something we've been doing a lot of work with the Wise Group on, for example. Um, don't quite understand just quite how difficult it can be for so many people.
Well, if you don't have any lived experience here, and if you don't have any contact with anybody who has any lived experience here, it's very easy to close your eyes and your ears to the kind of struggles that people have, or to take a slightly judgmental view that, oh well, it's it's their fault, and right back to Victorian times, we had the concept of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, as if somehow the differentiation, and some people were morally good but just not very clever, and other people were morally bad, and it really angers me to see that sort of false morality brought back into public debate in terms of eligibility for support and services. I thought we'd got away from that in the post-war period with the welfare state and the idea that each according to their ability to pay, each according to their ability, each according to their need, which is the founding principle of the NHS. And one of the things that I've learned over the last year working with the Purpose Coalition is the work that so many of our member organisations are doing in this space, which makes a difference. And it's not a big picture policy difference. It's not a massive regulatory change, but it makes a difference to the people it affects. And all those small interventions, acts, and support arrangements add up, I think, to a much bigger whole. And I think that's kind of what Keir was reflecting in the speech this morning, that there's a lot going on. And we know from the companies that you and I work with that there's not just a lot of work going on, but lots of potential to do more. But that needs to be backed by government, not be people feeling criticised or ridiculed for the things that they're doing, which can sometimes happen.
And on that point you raised around Greg's with free school meals, or free school breakfasts, do you think there's a role where provide there isn't going to be huge amounts of money for any government, whoever wins the next election, that there is a much bigger role for purpose-led organizations to actually be you helping with this kind of thing, with providing some of those services and making sure that they are helping to get people what they need when they need it.
I think the other I think you're absolutely right, and the trap that Labour could sometimes fall into, if we're honest, is has a very strong commitment to the idea of universal service provision, but that doesn't mean universality of service provision. And I think Keir's speech this morning kind of reflects that. For example, reforming childcare, for example, um, it's not just a case of having uh, a childcare market that can respond to need. It's something that has to be planned for, because there are always going to be some communities and some places that don't have as much childcare provision because they have a greater concentration of households on a lower income. Therefore, the returns aren't going to be so great if you just have a market-led approach. So that kind of point that he made around doing a sufficiency review, a plan for an area to make sure that the childcare provision in the area was going to match the number of children. I think that's a sensible role for the state to be doing. But it doesn't mean that the state then has to provide all that childcare. It means it can encourage it, can enable it, um, it can intervene if there are problems. And again, announcing that local authorities can set up childcare provision if it's necessary in an area. Well, that's a reform that I've been calling for and campaigning for years now, because by not being able to do it, that's meant that some communities have just missed out. And of course, it's not just the childcare in terms of the cognitive and behavioural development of the child. It's the childcare that enables parents to go to work, to get a better job, to work different hours. So childcare, I've often argued, that childcare should be seen as a national infrastructure priority in the same way as transport is.
Yeah, I know it's something you've spoken about, and it has such a big impact on the rest of the economy, doesn't it? In terms of parents not being able to go to work, or parents literally not being able to work, and it's one of the reasons why we have such big labour market shortages now that we are, all know about, and we've actually been doing some really interesting work on this with Chloe Smith, the former Work and Pensions Secretary. One of the things in what Labour announced today that I just thought was particularly interesting was around standards in schools. And I think you'll know this better than me, but I've always thought that some in Labour have had an uneasy relationship with the idea of things like Ofsted and wanting to see big reforms there. But they really have done a lot of a big focus on children's standards, and even talking about sort of standard report cards for children who are at nursery in the early years. So, what do you make of that? Why do you think the party's put such a big emphasis? It's number 3 in of those 5 key points under the mission. So, why do you think they've put such a big emphasis on it?
Well, there's um, probably a reflection of reality going on here that Labour's never going to abolish Ofsted. It might want to reform it, and certainly when she was Shadow's Education Secretary, Angela Rayner, it was clear that it needed reform long before the current Ofsted controversies hit the news. But you know, parents will vote with their feet if a school is not good. And having a warning system and an intervention that stops schools from getting into that position, I think, is important. So I think there's a recognition that there's a role there to be done. Whenever I've been with my sister to pick her kids up from nursery, they have a short chat with the staff that are around and give a bit of feedback of the day. And often it's like, this happened, might be worth keeping an eye on this, and he's a bit shy today, so might want to think about some opportunities to get him out and about and a bit more, things like that. So I'm not sure, if I'm honest, whether a formal report card system for kids in nursery school is necessary. In my experience, that's the kind of parent feedback that parents get on a daily basis. But I suppose if you think about it a bit more carefully, there may well be parents who don't feel comfortable talking about that, may not speak English terribly well, don't necessarily understand what's saying. So, it could, I suppose, be one of those things that enables conversations to be had in a way that helps that child's development. I wouldn't want it to become bureaucratic, though. I remember about a month before the summer holidays every year, when I was at school, teachers just disappeared because they had individual report cards to write for all of us. And they were quite some substantial works of fiction in many cases. I was dreadful at games, absolutely terrible at sports, hated it. And my best ever games report card said that Nick has finally mastered the scoring system in badminton, which was a very generous way of saying that I was at least good at something vaguely sport related.
I think I know the feeling, to be honest. I also remember on your point about report cards, getting various report cards sometimes saying, Josh has done very well at school this year, which has clearly been copied from a sort of standard paragraph throughout various other reports. But to be fair to teachers, they have an awful lot of them to write, and it can take an awful long time.
Mm.
I, and obviously the focus on standards for us at the Purpose Coalition, I think, is really, really important because we, as you know, next week we're launching our Raising Standards, Creating Opportunities campaign, and it's all about how universities can play a role in the school age sector as well, and things like going into schools and partnering with schools, to provide young people who may have no experience or understanding of university, is it really the right choice for them? For many people, it is the right choice, and we know the impact that's had on social mobility for so many people. But the but providing that advice where potential teachers aren't going to be best placed to provide that advice, I think is very important.
So, so much of the debate around education is focused on a narrow argument around quality of service provision within the system. And that's not unimportant, but that is definitely not the whole picture. And uh, when I used to work for a charity, one of the things I did was teach medical students um, about some of the social issues and challenges that they might face. And one of the exercises I used to do was to get them all out into the corridor or outside if it wasn't raining, and I would give them, I'd had about 20 little personality pro formas produced, and I'd give them a card. So, single mum, parent of three, um, or married, retired couple, that kind of thing. And I'd ask, so they're all lined up in a row, and I'd ask them a series of questions and say, if you can answer yes to this question, take a step forward. So, can you afford 3 meals a day? Can you afford an annual holiday to go abroad and de-stress? Can you take sick leave from work without being punished financially? Can you afford to go to university?
What were the
Can you afford,
findings
can
from
you afford your own home? And within about a dozen of those kind of questions, some people were still more or less where they started, and other people were at the other end of the corridor. And the point of that is to show that opportunity comes easier to some people than others because of some of the structural and social challenges that we face, the barriers. It's a bit like, when you go to an airport, you can either walk or you can get on the travelator, and the travelator gives you an advantage. And some people in life,
always later?
are born on a travelator. Not literally, I hope. I mean, that'd be quite painful.
But it's a really interesting way of you physically demonstrating opportunity.
The other thing for medical students, when I used to do that, it was a revelation to them that people had different chances in life than they had. So, something just couldn't comprehend the idea that you wouldn't have 3 meals a day. It's like, why wouldn't you? Well, there's a whole series of reasons why you wouldn't. You know, why wouldn't Daddy buy you a house to live in? You know, sorry, that's slightly exaggeration, but you know what I mean. There's sometimes we forget to have um, an understanding of other people's lives, and I think being able to step into other people's shoes, particularly as a politician, actually, because you can then understand other challenges that people face, is really, really important. And so, what I think we saw this morning with Keir's speech was understanding that this isn't a set of problems that are going to be solved through government intervention alone. Government needs to play its part, but we've all got a role to play. And, we've got so many examples from the work of our members, and uh, you and I can probably list dozens of them off the top of our head of small scale things that have had a huge impact for the people that they work with.
But on that, we work with dozens of different organizations and businesses and universities and local authorities and NHS Trust as well. It seems to me that there is a recognition of some of these challenges in a way that they are actually on, helping people with opportunity, whether it's Travelodge with the Aspire program or Sodexo with their Starting Fresh program, which I think is really innovative to help people who are coming out of prison rebuild their lives, for example. But is it not the case that that many of these organizations recognize these challenges, but there's maybe not the support there from government as it stands?
I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think firstly there's a but I think one of the things that COVID did was throw into really sharp relief a lot of these challenges that we've sort of lived with and implicitly accepted for a long time, and suddenly they became unsustainable and unsupportable in COVID. And I think that sort of reawoke people's consciences in a way that felt that they had to do something about it. And so I think particularly post-COVID, we've seen quite a lot of change in business approach and behavior, and understanding that they are part of communities as well as making a profit. And that's really exciting because that unlocks innovation and creativity and drive and passion amongst businesses, which is great. And one of the privileges we have is being able to help them share that and learn from each other. But then the other thing is, I think we've seen a retreating of the responsibility of government and somehow a rather corrosive idea that your fortunes in life are your fault. Well, if if you choose to be born into a poor community with poor parents, then it's your own fault, isn't it? That's kind of the thinking, I suppose, that sort of plays out in the approach. And often the parody response from Labour can feel like, oh, but the state needs to get involved, do all this stuff, or the state needs to fund lots of things to do all this stuff. No, that's not the case either. And I think what we've seen from Keir this morning is the idea that we've all got a role to play, we've all got something to contribute, we've all got something to learn, and we can do it together. And that means new partnerships, new relationships, a new sense of collective endeavour, but bound together by a core set of values that we're all working to achieve, which is everybody should be able to achieve everything that they're capable of in life. And there shouldn't be unachievable barriers that are put in front of some people, but not others. And our role as a Labour Party is to tear down those barriers.
And given the financial constraints that you just highlighted and we all know about, do you think a Labour government can be successful? It's a very different situation to 1997, when broadly the economy had recovered from the recession and Black Wednesday and all of the other challenges that we know about. I think even in that election, the Conservative slogan was "Britain is booming," wasn't it? It didn't seem to do them much good at the polls. But do you think, given the financial challenges, how do you think a Labour government will be able to deal with some of those things, or are they just going to spend all their time firefighting?
Well, I do think that potentially in here, you know, every government sows the seeds of its own self-destruction, and I, this is one of those "let's reach for the stars, but be criticised for only reaching the moon" kind of analogies. I think there's no doubt that a huge amount of work is needed, huge amount of effort. I think we'll see that, but it'll never be quite enough. And of course, the Labour Party is very, very good at self-criticism. It does it very often, very loudly, and very publicly. So, the Labour Party will be its own worst enemy when it comes to making progress here, because there'll be people saying, we're not doing enough, we're not going fast enough, we're not going far enough. But, every bit of work that goes on is valuable. And we shouldn't get hung up on it not being absolutely perfect for everybody all the time. Making a difference, I think, is what's going to matter.
Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Absolutely. And the Labour Party is actually quite good at allowing perfect, not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I remember people voting against the devolution proposals back in the mid 2000s in the Northeast, not because they were opposed to devolution, but because they were opposed to this very specific model of devolution and they had an alternative voting system that they wanted to put in place, or whatever it might be. So, sometimes, and I think it's a particular thing on the left, but I suppose it applies to everybody across the political spectrum in some way or other. Uh, People sometimes get a little hung up on how things should be, rather than just accepting that every bit of progress towards a better society makes life a little better for everybody.
I think it's a very interesting point, and you know, one of the things that the Conservative government has been very good at is refreshing itself and showing how and highlighting some of its achievements. And as you say, even when they're not quite right, and we can see that now with the five priorities that the Prime Minister is obviously talking an awful lot about. Briefly, before we wrap up, I just wanted to touch very briefly on um, the idea around skills, and there's been it's one of the, I think you would say this as well, from all of the organisations we speak to, the apprenticeship levy skills comes up almost all of the time, and there's a commitment obviously from Labour to replace the apprenticeship levy with a growth and skills levy, but there's no real meat on that, and I think that's quite understandable because the last thing they would want is their policy being stolen. I would be interested to see if there is any progress on this from government before the election, and we already know what happened with the childcare policy, that the government pretty much swallowed it whole. So you can see why there's a nervousness to reveal too much. But one of the things they have committed to today, which I think is interesting, is this idea of pushing skills spending outside Westminster, and that you can then make sure that communities can join up things like training and job opportunities locally with their priorities, and it's something we've seen obviously Andy Burnham talk a lot about, and also Sadiq Khan. But given your experience in local government, how do you think the impact of that could be?
Well, in one sense, I'm quite pleased that we've got a government which is in favour of early adoption of Labour policy, because it means we get a Labour government before we even elect one. Um, and I'm sure that's not the only thing that they've nicked. Um, but I used to have these conversations with business leaders when I was leader of Newcastle, and virtually every conversation about skills was, we've got a skills shortage either now or will have in the short term, and what are you going to do about it? And the problem was there was a sort of mismatch between the skills planning, the education system in the broader sense, and industry in the world of work. And there wasn't really a joined up conversation. There was an understanding about where the challenges were, and all sorts of attempts to bridge those gaps. And that's partly what I think the apprenticeship levy was, a sort of attempt to try to bridge that gap between learning and industry. But I think we need a fundamental rethink here. And if you think about it, the amount that we spend collectively as a country in investing in people is actually significant, because you've got the entirety of the education budget. You've got universities, you've got further education colleges, you've got the apprenticeship levy, or the growth and skills levy, as it would be called under Labour. You've then got what individual companies invest in their own staff. And part of the challenge culturally with education is that we tend to think it's something that you do until you've got a degree, and then you go off into the world of work and that's the end of it. Whereas actually, if you look at the way that our economies are developing, the significance of knowledge-led approaches to solving new solutions, focusing on the big challenges today like sustainable energy and life sciences and technology, people are going to have to learn all the way throughout their lives, but the system isn't geared up to do that. So bringing together all of those collective resources that are available, joining up the conversation, and making it as easy as possible for people to develop and gain the skills that they need throughout their working lives, I think is going to be a huge challenge, but one that has so much payoff in terms of economic productivity, people feeling that they're progressing, personal job satisfaction, and a sense of achievement. And the other point around this is that moving it out of Westminster is a significant signal. And this, for me, is just a bit of a no-brainer, because if we accept that our economy is different in different parts of the country, so we have financial services concentrated in London, we have media in various places around the country. We have automotive engineering and uh, uh, manufacturing in some parts of the country. We have here in Newcastle, off the North Bank of the Tyne, we've got subsea technologies. If you accept that you've got those differences around the country, then you also surely need a tailored approach to the skills that those economic sectors will need in the future. That doesn't mean it can't be underpinned by a common framework that people can compare different types of qualification because basically lots of things contribute to a BA or a BSc. That people understand that. So you do need a national framework, but greater flexibility, greater joining up at a local level, I think, is not just Labour's vision, but I would argue is absolutely essential to get the kind of progress that we want to see.
I think it's fascinating on the skills point because it feels almost one of the most radical parts of the plan, and it could mean that you have a far more joined up and local approach to skill spending. And it is, as I say, I go back to the point. It is consistently the issue that is raised by organizations who just want to be able to just do a bit more to do more with their levy, to be able to to solve some of the challenges. Most people, the vast majority, are still in favor of the levy, but I think if there is a real demand out there to make it more flexible, and the impact on the economy of that could be fairly significant.
Part of the culture that we've seen grow up in this country is the idea that, and I don't mean that in a positive way, by the way, is the idea that somehow um, people should just be able to expect applicants walking through their door with exactly the kind of skills that they're going to need
Yeah.
in the future. And firstly, that doesn't recognise the complexity of the world of work these days, and the huge variety of technical skills that people need for all sorts of things. But it also sort of closes off opportunity at a very early stage of recruitment, because if you say, for example, we only want to recruit people with a particular type of degree, well, you've automatically excluded half the population.
Mm.
And that's just one of those very simple, practical examples I know we work through with the organisations we work with, just to have a look at your recruitment processes to make sure you're not ruling talent out inadvertently because of deep-seated uh, prejudices or simply accepting that that's the way that things should be. And um, I think having a we're not again we're never going to come up with a perfect system here around skills and training. I think one that feels more about a collective approach than a sort of this is what we need, this is what you need to provide state kind of conversation. It instinctively to me feels a lot more productive and uh, hopefully um, people also see the opportunity for beneficial change. The one thing, if there's one specific thing that I would like to have seen Keir Starmer announce today, it would be moving the apprenticeship levy from the Department for Education with responsibility to business and industry, because apprenticeships are seen by the current government as part of the education system. Actually, I think we get far better impact if we see them as accessing the world of work and putting that alongside the uh, other types of employment support that there is available for people at times of need. And it's that might sound like a simple rearrangement of government departments, but actually it would send a hugely powerful signal that education isn't an island that you go to in early part of your life and never visit again. It's here for all of us all the time when we need it.
I think it's a really important point, and we we often think of education as for the first 18 years of your life, but like you referenced in the new economy, the changing economy, we see stories every single day about the power and potential threats and opportunities from AI. Learning throughout your whole life, whether we call it lifelong learning or upskilling, whatever it's called, is going to be so important.
And let's not also forget that education, in the broader sense, isn't just about making our economy a better economy, a stronger economy, a more resilient economy. Yes, of course, it is all about those things and making sure that we have the skills for the future of the population collectively. It's also about what it is to be a human in the 21st century and to be able to not just live and cope with a complex society, but to enjoy life and enjoy the opportunities that it presents. And um, I might sound like um, a bit of an enlightenment figure, talking like this, but the idea that actually education opens up people's life chances as well as people's economic opportunities, I think is a really important principle that we shouldn't lose sight of. And things like making friends or doing things that challenge you or stretch you or uh, those kind of things, the kind of experiences that you get at university that you might not get elsewhere, the kind of
Mhm.
things that continue to shape us as complex individuals.
Well, Nick, it's been absolutely fantastic to talk today about this. I think
Well,
it
we've
is
had
clear.
laughter and tears and interrupting sheep, so what else are we going to have?
Well, okay, let's see what next week. Let's wait and
Top
see
this one next week, Matthew.
what you surprise me with. Um, but this has been probably the most hotly anticipated mission of all of them for the Purpose Coalition. It's something that we've all been talking about and all been waiting on. Of course, it also completes the five, and I think everything that we do in terms of talking with the Labour Party, with engaging with them, is now going to be very much aligned to those missions, and I think that'll be very important. But I think it'll be a fascinating conversation.
I think what you can see if you read beyond the immediate detail is the bones of a vision for the future of this country, which is about greater opportunity for everybody, greater sense of fairness, greater sense of social justice than we have at the moment. And that is really about uh, time that we have that vision for what a better Britain could look like. And I know that there's a huge amount of people just willing to work towards that goal.
Well, I guess we will have to see what comes at the Labour Party conference next, which will presumably be the next chapter in this vision for what the party presents to the country at the next election.
Well, we'll be there with our Purpose Coalition
There you
members and we'll be debating exactly these issues. So, uh, hope that some of the people that are listening to this might come participate and not be
go.
too rude, even if they've had a glass of wine or two.
Well, I look forward to it.
Me too. Thanks,
Thanks,
Matthew.
Nick. Bye bye.